What happens when hospital staff discriminate against a 14-year-old black girl seeking emergency care? Their shock when her CEO mother arrived was unforgettable. Maya Johnson pushed through the heavy glass doors of St. Mary's Medical Center, her left side burning with a pain that had been building since breakfast. At 14, she possessed the kind of quiet confidence that comes from being raised by a woman who never accepted excuses, never tolerated mediocrity, and certainly never backed down from a fight. The antiseptic smell hit her immediately, that unmistakable blend of industrial cleaning products and barely contained human misery that marked every hospital she had ever visited. Maya clutched her insurance card in one hand and her student identification in the other, documents her mother had drilled into her to always carry. Preparation prevents problems, Dr. Elena Johnson always said, though she probably never imagined her daughter would need to navigate a medical emergency alone while she was presenting at a conference 3,000 miles away in Geneva. Maya's athletic shoes squeaked against the polished linoleum as she approached the registration desk. Her school sweatshirt, faded from too many washes, hung loose over her small frame. She had always been petite for her age, a fact that seemed to make adults either overly protective or dismissively condescending. Today she suspected it would be the latter. Behind the curved reception desk sat Susan Mitchell, a woman whose 40-something years had settled into the kind of permanent scowl that suggested life had been personally offensive to her. Susan's perfectly styled blonde hair formed a helmet of respectability, and her manicured nails clicked against the keyboard with the precision of someone who took great pleasure in making others wait. When Maya approached, Susan's eyes performed that particular dance of assessment that Maya had witnessed countless times before. The quick scan from head to toe, the slight narrowing around the corners, the almost imperceptible tightening of the lips. "I need to see a doctor," Maya said, her voice steady despite the growing pain. "I think I might have appendicitis." Susan's eyebrows rose in what might have been surprise or skepticism. "Appendicitis? That's quite a diagnosis for someone your age. Where are your parents?" "My mother is traveling for work. She's a doctor herself, and she told me the symptoms to watch for. I have insurance." Maya placed her cards on the counter with the deliberate care of someone who had been taught that first impressions mattered. Susan picked up the insurance card as if it might contaminate her fingers. She held it at arm's length, squinting at the information with theatrical suspicion. "This is a very expensive plan. Are you sure this belongs to your family?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been deliberately set. Maya felt her cheeks warm, but she kept her voice level. "Yes, I'm sure. My mother is Dr. Elena Johnson. She works in medical administration." "Medical administration?" Susan repeated the words as if they tasted sour. "And she just lets her 14-year-old daughter run around to emergency rooms by herself." "She's at a conference in Switzerland. I tried calling, but she's in meetings. This is an emergency." Susan's fingers resumed their clicking symphony on the keyboard, each tap sounding more aggressive than the last. "Well, we'll need to verify everything. Insurance fraud is a serious problem these days, especially with certain populations." Maya's hands tightened around the edge of the counter. She had heard that particular pause before, the one that carried the weight of unspoken assumptions. "What exactly do you mean by certain populations?" "Oh, nothing specific. Just that we have procedures to follow, rules to maintain standards." Susan's smile was the kind that never reached the eyes, the type that Maya's mother had taught her to recognize as a warning sign. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Maya watched as other patients arrived and were processed with remarkable efficiency. An elderly white couple was greeted with warm smiles and immediate attention. A middle-aged businessman was whisked away to an examination room within minutes of presenting his identification. But Maya remained standing at the counter, watching Susan shuffle through papers with the urgency of someone examining paint samples for a bathroom renovation. "Is there a problem with my insurance?" Maya asked after 20 minutes of theatrical verification. "We're just being thorough. You understand." What Maya understood was that she was being deliberately stalled, but saying so would only provide Susan with more ammunition. Instead, she focused on breathing through the increasing pain and observing the curious ballet of selective service happening around her. That was when Barbara Wilson emerged from the administrative office like a general, surveying a battlefield. Barbara had the kind of presence that commanded attention, not through warmth or charisma, but through the sheer force of institutional authority. Her nursing uniform was pressed to military precision, her silver hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of disapproval. She approached the registration desk with the measured steps of someone who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of professional intimidation. What seems to be the problem here? Barbara's voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. Susan leaned forward conspiratorially. This young lady claims to have appendicitis, says her mother is a doctor, but something doesn't add up. The insurance seems questionable. Barbara's gaze fixed on Maya with the intensity of a microscope examining bacteria. Appendicitis? Young people today think every stomach ache is a medical emergency. Probably too much fast food and not enough exercise. Maya felt her patience begin to fray at the edges. I've been experiencing sharp pain in my lower right abdomen for several hours, along with nausea and fever. These are classic symptoms of acute appendicitis. Classic symptoms, Barbara repeated with a laugh that held no humor. Did you learn that from internet research? Young people today think Google makes them medical experts. I learned it from my mother, who is a physician, and from volunteering at the community clinic where I help with patient intake. This information seemed to irritate Barbara rather than reassure her. Community clinic? Well, that explains the attitude. We run a professional facility here, not some charity operation. We have standards to maintain. Maya's pain was escalating, but so was her anger. She had been raised to respect authority, but she had also been taught to recognize when authority was being abused. What standards require you to delay emergency treatment based on assumptions about my background? Barbara's eyes flashed with something that might have been surprise or annoyance at being challenged. Assumptions? We're following protocol, standard verification procedures. If you don't like our methods, perhaps you should consider going somewhere more suitable to your circumstances. The suggestion hung in the air like a physical slap. Maya understood exactly what Barbara meant by suitable to your circumstances, and the knowledge burned hotter than the pain in her abdomen. I'll wait for the verification, Maya said quietly, but her voice carried the kind of steel that her mother had taught her to forge from dignity and determination. Barbara exchanged a look with Susan, the kind of silent communication that passes between people who have perfected the art of systematic exclusion. Very well. Susan will escort you to our special waiting area. We'll get to you when we can. The special waiting area turned out to be a corner section separated from the main waiting room by a glass partition. It contained fewer chairs, older magazines, and a clear view of the supply storage area where Maya could observe the constant movement of medical staff. As she settled into an uncomfortable plastic chair, Maya began to notice patterns that troubled her far more than her physical discomfort. She watched Barbara and Susan moving between the storage area and their personal belongings with suspicious frequency. Medical supplies seemed to disappear into personal bags with remarkable regularity. Expensive equipment was being relocated to areas that seemed more suited for personal access than patient care. What Maya was witnessing looked less like standard medical procedure and more like a carefully orchestrated system of institutional theft. The pain in her side pulsed with increasing intensity, but Maya's mind remained sharp. She had been taught to observe, to analyze, to document, and what she was observing was a hospital where discrimination and corruption seemed to walk hand in hand through sterile corridors, leaving patients like her isolated in corners while medical supplies walked out the door in designer handbags. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the waiting room floor, Maya realized that she had stumbled into something far more complex than a simple case of medical bias. She was witnessing a systematic operation that would make her mother's professional blood boil if Maya ever got the chance to tell her about it. The pain in her abdomen was becoming impossible to ignore, but Maya forced herself to remain alert. Something told her that this afternoon was far from over, and that the real emergency might not be the one bringing her to the hospital in the first place. Part 2. The Pressure Cooker. The specialized waiting area felt like being placed in a fishbowl filled with uncomfortable plastic chairs and 10-year-old magazines about celebrity divorces. Maya had been sitting for nearly 2 hours, watching the systematic dismantling of medical inventory through the glass partition that separated her from the main emergency department. What had initially appeared to be standard hospital operations now revealed itself as something far more calculated and corrupt. Barbara Wilson emerged from the supply room carrying what appeared to be a box of expensive cardiac monitoring equipment. She moved with the confidence of someone who had perfected the art of hiding theft in plain sight. The box disappeared into a large designer bag that certainly had not been standard nursing equipment when Maya had entered the hospital. Maya made a mental note of the time, 4:47 in the afternoon. Her mother had taught her that details mattered, especially when witnessing something that would eventually require explanation. Dr. Richard Stone appeared in the waiting area like a storm cloud gathering momentum. His white coat bore the kind of wrinkles that suggested he had been working long hours, but his expression indicated that his patience had expired somewhere around lunchtime. He was a man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who had grown accustomed to being the smartest person in the room and had little tolerance for having that assumption challenged. "Miss Johnson," he said, consulting a clipboard with theatrical deliberation, "I understand you believe you have appendicitis." Maya stood carefully, the pain in her side making sudden movements inadvisable. "I have classic symptoms of acute appendicitis. Sharp pain in the lower right quadrant, nausea, low-grade fever. These symptoms have been progressing for several hours." Dr. Stone made a show of examining her from a distance, the kind of cursory visual assessment that suggested he had already reached his conclusions before entering the room. Young people often mistake growing pains for serious medical conditions. Have you been eating properly? Getting enough sleep? Sometimes stress manifests as physical symptoms. "Doctor, I volunteer at the community health clinic. I am familiar with stress responses versus actual medical emergencies." This is not psychological. The mention of the community clinic seemed to trigger something unpleasant in Dr. Stone's expression. "Ah, yes, the community clinic. Those facilities often give young people inflated ideas about their medical knowledge. Real medicine requires years of training and proper oversight." Maya felt her mother's voice echoing in her mind. When someone tries to diminish your knowledge, it usually means they are threatened by it. She kept her tone level and professional. "Dr. Stone, what is the standard protocol for evaluating suspected appendicitis in adolescent patients?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been deliberately ignored. Dr. Stone's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Protocol? Young lady, I do not need to justify medical protocols to someone who learned medicine from a community pamphlet. Actually," Maya continued with the persistence of someone who had been raised never to accept dismissal as an answer, "the standard protocol involves physical examination, blood work to check for elevated white cell count, and potentially imaging studies. How long is considered medically appropriate to delay this evaluation?" Dr. Stone exchanged a look with Barbara, who had returned from her supply room expedition empty-handed, but somehow looking more prosperous. The silent communication between them spoke volumes about institutional complicity and shared secrets. "Miss Johnson," Barbara interjected with the tone of someone explaining obvious concepts to someone particularly slow, "we are following our standard procedures. Perhaps you would be more comfortable at a facility that specializes in community-based care." The suggestion carried the sting of deliberate insult. Maya recognized the technique. Dress discrimination in the language of helpfulness. Make exclusion sound like a favor. She had seen her mother navigate these same treacherous waters countless times. "I will wait for proper medical evaluation," Maya said quietly. "My insurance is valid, my symptoms are genuine, and I am entitled to the same standard of care as any other patient." Dr. Stone's patience appeared to evaporate like morning fog under harsh sunlight. "Entitled? Young lady, you seem to have a very inflated sense of your importance. This is a prestigious medical facility, not some clinic where people expect handouts." The word handouts landed like a physical blow. Maya felt her composure wavering for the first time since entering the hospital. The pain in her abdomen was intensifying, but the pain of systematic humiliation was becoming almost unbearable. A teenage boy in the main waiting area had apparently been documenting the entire exchange with his smartphone. His mother, a Latina woman with the tired eyes of someone who had fought too many battles with institutional indifference, watched the proceedings with recognition and sympathy. An elderly couple whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed approval of Maya's treatment. The atmosphere was charged with the kind of tension that precedes either surrender or explosion. Maya chose neither option. Instead, she reached into the reservoir of strength that her mother had spent 14 years helping her build. The flashback came unbidden, triggered by the familiar sensation of being underestimated and dismissed. Maya was 10 years old, standing in the supply room of the community health clinic where her mother had been volunteering since medical school. Dr. Elena Johnson was teaching her daughter how to inventory medical supplies, explaining the delicate balance between resource management and patient care. Maya, her mother had said, checking expiration dates on medication bottles, there will be times when people try to make you feel small because of how you look, where you come from, or what they assume about your circumstances. Remember that their assumptions say nothing about you and everything about them. Young Maya had watched her mother work with quiet efficiency, treating each patient with the same careful attention, regardless of their ability to pay or their social status. But what if they have power over me? What if they can hurt me? Dr. Johnson had paused in her inventory, giving her daughter the kind of serious attention that children recognize as important. Power used to harm others is not real power, sweetheart. Real power comes from knowledge, preparation, and the courage to stand up for what is right. They can delay you, frustrate you, even humiliate you temporarily. But they cannot diminish who you are unless you let them. The memory provided Maya with the anchor she needed. She straightened her shoulders and fixed Dr. Stone with the kind of steady gaze that her mother had perfected during 20 years of fighting medical bureaucracy. Dr. Stone, she said with quiet authority, I am requesting that you document in my medical record that you are declining to evaluate a patient presenting with classic appendicitis symptoms. I would also like you to note the specific medical reasons for this delay, along with the time frame that has elapsed since my arrival. The request struck the assembled medical staff like cold water on a campfire. Documentation meant accountability. Records meant potential legal liability. Paper trails meant questions that would eventually require answers from people with actual authority. Dr. Stone's confident demeanor developed hairline cracks. Now see here, young lady, you do not get to dictate medical procedures to qualified physicians. I am not dictating anything. I am requesting documentation of the care I am receiving, which is my legal right as a patient. Unless, of course, there are reasons why you would prefer not to create a written record of today's events. Barbara stepped forward with the aggressive energy of someone whose authority had been questioned once too often. Dr. Stone, I think we need to call security. This patient is becoming disruptive and argumentative. Maya felt a flash of genuine amusement despite her pain. Disruptive? I have been sitting quietly for over 2 hours, asking reasonable questions and requesting standard medical care. If that constitutes disruption, then perhaps the problem is not with my behavior. The teenage boy with the smartphone moved closer, his device capturing every word. His mother had also begun recording, her expression suggesting she had witnessed this particular performance before. The elderly couple continued their whispered commentary, but their disapproval seemed to be shifting toward the medical staff rather than Maya. Security arrived in the form of a large man whose uniform suggested authority, but whose expression indicated he had not been briefed on the complexities of the situation. Michael Green, the hospital technician who had been moving supplies with suspicious frequency, accompanied the security guard with the nervous energy of someone whose secrets might be about to become public knowledge. What seems to be the problem? The security guard asked with the weary tone of someone who dealt with hospital drama on a regular basis. Barbara launched into an explanation that painted Maya as an aggressive, demanding patient who was disrupting hospital operations and questioning medical authority. Her version of events bore little resemblance to reality, but it was delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her word accepted without question. Maya waited until Barbara finished her performance before responding. Officer, I arrived with symptoms of acute appendicitis approximately 2.5 hours ago. I have been placed in this isolated waiting area, while other patients with less urgent conditions have been seen and treated. When I asked about standard medical protocols, I was told that my questions were inappropriate. I have requested documentation of the care I am receiving, and I was told that this request was disruptive. The security guard looked between the medical staff and the teenage girl with the expression of someone who had stumbled into a situation far more complicated than his training had prepared him to handle. "Miss," he said carefully, "if you have legitimate medical concerns, the hospital staff are the ones qualified to evaluate them." "That is exactly what I have been requesting," Maya replied with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a confused child. "Medical evaluation, standard care, equal treatment. If these requests are considered unreasonable, then perhaps someone could explain why." Michael Green shifted nervously behind the security guard, his eyes darting between the supply room and the exit as if calculating escape routes. Maya noticed his anxiety and filed it away as another piece of the puzzle she was slowly assembling. The tension in the waiting area had reached the point where even casual observers were beginning to take sides. The teenager with the smartphone had captured enough footage to fuel a social media storm. His mother had produced her own device and was now conducting a parallel documentation process. Even the elderly couple had stopped whispering and were watching the proceedings with the fascination of people witnessing a car accident in slow motion. Maya realized that she had reached a crossroads. She could continue to wait passively, accepting whatever treatment the hospital staff chose to provide. She could escalate the conflict by becoming more demanding or confrontational. Or she could trust in the foundation her mother had built and the lessons she had learned about dignity, persistence, and the power of refusing to accept the unacceptable. The pain in her abdomen was becoming impossible to ignore, but Maya had learned that some battles required enduring temporary discomfort for the sake of long-term justice. She had also learned that institutional corruption often revealed itself when pressure was applied in the right places. As the security guard waited for her response, and the medical staff prepared for whatever came next, Maya made a decision that would change everything. She was about to discover that some moments define not just who you are, but who you choose to become when the world tries to make you smaller than you know yourself to be. Part 3. The Reckoning. Maya took a deep breath, feeling the familiar surge of determination that her mother had spent years cultivating within her. The security guard waited for her response while Barbara Wilson and Dr. Stone positioned themselves like generals preparing for a final battle they assumed they would win. The assembled witnesses held their smartphones steady, documenting what they believed would be the removal of a troublesome teenager from a prestigious medical facility. None of them were prepared for what happened next. The emergency department doors burst open with the force of someone who had traveled 3,000 miles in 12 hours after receiving an emergency call from her daughter's school. Dr. Elena Johnson entered St. Mary's Medical Center like a force of nature wrapped in a perfectly tailored business suit. Her presence commanded immediate attention, not through volume or aggression, but through the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to solving problems that others found impossible. She moved through the waiting room with surgical precision, her eyes taking inventory of the situation with the speed of someone trained to make life or death decisions under pressure. Her gaze found Maya sitting in the isolated corner, surrounded by hospital staff and security, and Elena's expression shifted from professional concern to controlled fury in the space of a heartbeat. "Maya," she said, her voice carrying the kind of warmth that could melt Arctic ice while simultaneously conveying steel-reinforced determination. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" The transformation in the emergency department was immediate and profound. Barbara Wilson's confident posture crumbled as she recognized the woman approaching them. Susan Mitchell emerged from behind the registration desk, her face draining of color as she processed the implications of what was unfolding. Dr. Stone's authoritative bearing evaporated like morning mist under direct sunlight. Maya stood carefully, her side still burning with pain, but her spirit soaring with relief. "I'm okay, Mom, but there are some things you need to know." Elena reached her daughter and conducted a brief but thorough visual assessment that confirmed Maya was stable but clearly in distress. Then she turned to face the assembled hospital staff with the expression of someone who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of professional warfare. "I am Dr. Elena Johnson," she announced, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the vicinity stop what they were doing and pay attention. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Johnson Medical Group, which owns this hospital and 14 others in this state. I am also Maya's mother. The silence that followed was so complete that the humming of fluorescent lights sounded like thunder. Barbara Wilson's face cycled through several shades of pale before settling on a sickly gray. Dr. Stone appeared to be calculating whether it was possible to disappear into the floor through sheer force of will. Susan Mitchell had retreated behind her desk as if the registration counter could provide protection from the storm about to break. Elena's attention fixed on her daughter with laser focus. Maya, please tell me exactly what has happened since you arrived. Maya had been preparing for this moment without realizing it. Her mother had taught her to be observant, to document details, and to present information clearly and concisely. She launched into a systematic recounting of the previous 3 hours, beginning with the suspicious delay at registration and progressing through the systematic discrimination she had experienced. But Mom, Maya continued, her voice gaining strength as she revealed the most damaging information. There's something else. While I was waiting, I observed what appears to be systematic theft of medical equipment and supplies. Elena's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained professionally controlled. Explain. Maya pointed toward the supply room where she had witnessed the suspicious activity. Barbara Wilson and Michael Green have been removing expensive medical equipment and placing it in personal bags. I observed cardiac monitors, pharmaceutical supplies, and surgical instruments being taken from hospital inventory. I documented times and specific items. The revelation hit the assembled staff like a physical blow. Michael Green, who had been lurking near the back of the group, began edging toward the exit with the obvious intention of disappearing before questions could be asked. Elena noticed his movement and fixed him with a gaze that stopped him in his tracks. "Mr. Green," she said with deceptive calm, "I believe you should remain available for questioning." Elena turned to address the broader situation with the systematic approach of someone who had spent decades solving complex problems. "Dr. Stone, I need you to immediately examine my daughter for acute appendicitis. Standard protocol includes blood work, physical examination, and appropriate imaging studies. This evaluation should have been completed hours ago." Dr. Stone stumbled over his words as he attempted to explain the delay. "Dr. Johnson, we were following our verification procedures." "Verification procedures," Elena repeated, her tone suggesting that she found the explanation both inadequate and insulting. "Dr. Stone, what verification procedures require a patient with acute appendicitis symptoms to wait over 3 hours for evaluation while staff members engage in theft of hospital property?" The question hung in the air like an accusation that everyone knew was accurate, but no one wanted to acknowledge. Elena continued her systematic dismantling of the situation with the precision of a surgeon removing diseased tissue. "Barbara, I need you to explain why medical supplies were being removed from hospital inventory and placed in personal belongings. I also need you to explain why my daughter was isolated in a separate waiting area and denied standard medical care." Barbara Wilson attempted to construct a defense, but her words emerged as a stammering collection of half-explanations and desperate justifications. "Dr. Johnson, we had concerns about insurance verification, and the supplies were being relocated for inventory purposes." "Relocated to personal handbags for inventory purposes?" Elena's voice carried the kind of professional skepticism that could cut through steel. "Barbara, how long have you been relocating hospital property to personal bags for inventory purposes?" The teenagers who had been recording the confrontation were capturing every word, their smartphones documenting what would soon become a social media phenomenon. The Latina mother who had witnessed Maya's treatment was recording her own version of events, her expression suggesting that she recognized justice being served after years of witnessing injustice ignored. Elena turned her attention to the broader systemic issues with the thoroughness of someone conducting a comprehensive audit. "Susan, I need you to provide records of all patient interactions from today, along with documentation of verification procedures applied to each patient. I want to understand whether these delays and discriminatory practices represent standard policy or individual decisions." Susan Mitchell's confident demeanor had completely collapsed. She fumbled through paperwork with trembling hands, clearly understanding that her employment was hanging by a thread that was rapidly unraveling. Elena's phone buzzed with incoming calls from other executives who had been alerted to the situation developing at St. Mary's. She answered one call with professional efficiency. "Yes, this is Dr. Johnson. I need immediate implementation of Protocol 7 at St. Mary's. Full audit, immediate suspension of involved personnel, and comprehensive review of patient care standards. The situation requires immediate intervention." Maya watched her mother work with a mixture of pride and amazement. This was Elena Johnson in her professional element, systematic, thorough, and absolutely unstoppable when confronting institutional failure. Within 30 minutes, Maya was receiving proper medical evaluation from a different physician who confirmed acute appendicitis and immediately prepared her for surgery. The hospital's administration arrived to conduct damage control and implement immediate reforms. Barbara Wilson and Michael Green were escorted from the premises pending investigation of theft charges. Dr. Stone found himself explaining his decision-making process to hospital administrators, who were clearly unimpressed with his reasoning. Susan Mitchell was reassigned to duties that did not involve patient interaction while her conduct was reviewed. But the most profound transformation occurred among the witnesses who had observed the entire situation unfold. The teenagers who had recorded the events were sharing their footage with captions about standing up to discrimination and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. The Latina mother approached Elena to express gratitude for demonstrating that institutional bias could be challenged and overcome. Even the elderly couple who had initially seemed supportive of Maya's poor treatment approached to apologize and express admiration for her composure under pressure. As Maya was being prepared for surgery, Elena sat beside her daughter's hospital bed with the expression of someone who had fought a battle and achieved victory, but understood that the war for equality and justice required constant vigilance. "Mom," Maya said, her voice drowsy from pre-surgical medication, "I was scared, but I remembered what you taught me about dignity and persistence." Elena smoothed her daughter's hair with infinite tenderness. "You handled yourself with grace under pressure, sweetheart. You stood up for what was right, and you documented important information that will help other patients receive better care." "Will things really change?" Maya asked, her 14-year-old optimism tempered by her recent experience with institutional indifference. Elena's smile carried the wisdom of someone who had spent decades fighting for systemic change. "Change happens when people refuse to accept the unacceptable, Maya. Today, you refuse to accept discrimination. You documented corruption. You maintained your dignity when others tried to diminish it. That is how change begins. One person at a time, one situation at a time, one refusal to be diminished at a time." 6 months later, St. Mary's Medical Center had implemented comprehensive reforms in patient care, staff training, and inventory management. The hospital became a model for equitable treatment and systematic accountability. Barbara Wilson and Michael Green faced criminal charges for theft, while Dr. Stone completed mandatory training in cultural competency and patient advocacy. Maya recovered fully from her surgery and returned to volunteering at the community health clinic, where she shared her experience with other young people facing discrimination in healthcare settings. She had learned that standing up for justice was not a single moment of courage, but a sustained commitment to refusing to accept the unacceptable. The footage recorded by the teenage witnesses became part of a broader conversation about healthcare equity and institutional accountability. Maya's story demonstrated that dignity and persistence could overcome even entrenched systems of bias and corruption. Elena established a scholarship program for young people pursuing careers in healthcare administration, with special emphasis on candidates committed to equitable patient care. She often told recipients that real leadership meant creating systems where everyone received the respect and care that Maya had initially been denied. The emergency department at St. Mary's now displays a plaque that reads, "Excellence in healthcare requires treating every patient with dignity, respect, and equal care. No exceptions, no excuses, no delays." It serves as a daily reminder that institutional change begins with individual commitment to justice. Maya's experience taught her that some battles choose you rather than the other way around. When faced with discrimination and corruption, she could have remained silent, accepted poor treatment, or allowed others to diminish her worth. Instead, she chose to document, persist, and maintain her dignity under pressure. The lesson extends far beyond hospital waiting rooms. In every institution, in every community, in every situation where power is used to diminish rather than serve, there are opportunities to stand up for what is right. Maya's story demonstrates that age, size, or perceived status do not determine your ability to demand justice and create change. Sometimes the most powerful response to institutional bias is simply refusing to accept it as normal or inevitable. Maya learned that her mother's teachings about dignity and persistence were not just family values. They were tools for transforming the world, one interaction at a time.